My guest today is Dr. PJ Caposey. He is the superintendent of Meridian School District number 223 in Stillman Valley, Illinois. He is an award-winning educator, a keynote speaker, an ASCD emerging leader, and author of 7 books on time management, teacher evaluation, student success strategies, and student voice. Today, we're going to be talking about different things that have led PJ to where he is today. In the pre-chat, we talked about how you've gotten to where you are today. Let's go ahead and start out with a little bit of background information, kind of your journey through education. You were quite a young principal, and having been a principal and a superintendent for a number of years already, let us know a little bit about your story.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Dana. There's 2 ways I can tell my story. I'll try to do my best and keep it brief on both. The one is the typical read of the resume. And I grew up in an upper middle class suburban household and went to a large high school of 5,000 students. From there, went to college. And when I came back, I decided I wanted to teach in an urban environment. And the school that I taught the entirety of my career at in Chicago Public Schools was truly an inner city school. And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. But now that I've been able to travel around the country and see schools, I think there's a definitive difference between urban and inner city. And so my teaching career was spent in a true inner city environment.
Okay.
When my second child was born, I decided that I didn't want to raise my sons in the city. And so I started to look for jobs outside of Chicago, because in Chicago, to work within that district, you have to live within the confines of the city of Chicago. Mm-hmm. So the second largest urban environment in Illinois at the time was Rockford. And so I left and became an assistant principal in Rockford Public Schools. Mm-hmm. I was there for 2 years, and then I started to look to get closer back to home. And so I was looking back toward the burbs, and on the way home, there was a highway sign to turn off for Oregon, Illinois. And I had never been in Oregon and never thought about it, except I drove by that sign several times on the way back to my parents' house. And as I was looking for jobs to go back into the suburbs, I saw a principal position open up, and I threw my hat in the ring. And I was lucky enough to be named principal at 27 years old. And I was able to do some really good things there. And we had a significant turnaround in 4 years. We went from the lowest performing school in the county to being recognized as one of the highest performing in the nation. And that afforded me the opportunity to come over to a neighboring district, which is Meridian 223, as superintendent. And at that district, I was the 5th superintendent in 3 calendar years. Mm-hmm. So things were a little bit less than stable. And I've been very fortunate to be in this district since. And again, we've had a lot of similar success and turnaround. The student performance was always very high within this district, but again, the culture and the adult performance, particularly at the higher levels of district administration, were not. And so we've been able to make a pretty nice transition that way. So that would be the resume version of telling you who I am. The real version would be that I've had 3 major events that have shaped who I am as a human. The first one is that I'm a 3-time cancer survivor. Mm-hmm. So I attack the day. I don't take time for granted. And I think that the COVID pandemic has done this a little bit for society and let everyone know to honor the day and to value the day, and that time is not an infinite resource. I've been fortunate to kind of live my life that way for the last 20 years, which is why I think I've had the level of success that I've had. Mm-hmm. The second would be the parallel of bringing my first 2 children into the world at the same time of teaching in the inner city of Chicago, and seeing a very stark parallel that there are 2 definitive Americas, if not more, now that I teach in a rural environment. But I saw the environment in which my sons were going to be raised, and I saw the environment that my other kids that I was trying to serve in the classroom were being raised. And I kind of made a vow to myself to always work to be an advocate and to do whatever I could to do better on behalf of the kids that are traditionally underserved. And I think that is, again, as we're recording this, we're at one of the most pivotal times in our nation as this question is continually being called out. And then the third would be in my first year as a principal, I created enormous amount of change. And it led to, and this is embarrassing to say, but a teacher and student walkout based on the leadership I was providing. And while I was making all of the textbook correct decisions, I was not leading people. Mm-hmm. And I realized in that moment that leadership is about people and not policies or programs. And it took me a long time to earn back the culture that I had broken and the trust that I had lost. But it has defined me as a leader now, and that's who I am. That sits before you and talks to you on this podcast.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for bringing those two parallels, the resume version and the personal version. Just having been a cancer survivor, and you say that you've been living, just taking every moment not for granted in the past 20 years and living your life the way you have. Would you say that you are a go-getter? The fact that you became a principal so young, you were a principal for 4 years, and now you've been a young superintendent already for 7 years. Would you call yourself a go-getter in that sense?
I would say that I'm ambitious.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would take go-getter, right? I definitely have been called worse. But I would say that I'm ambitious, and that typically when I'm involved in a situation and I see that it needs to be corrected, I either want to assume a certain level of control or influence over the situation, or I go to find a place where I could do that work. And as I've progressed throughout my career, it's been at the time where I feel, so as a teacher, once I started to see things that were dysfunctional within the building that I wanted to fix, then I knew it was time for administration. As an assistant principal, once I could see very clearly that my principal, who is great to me and is a mentor, but I could see the things that I would do just like him, but I also see the things that I would never do, then I thought it was ready for me to take the next chance. And I was very fortunate in Oregon as a principal to have a superintendent that felt it part of his duty to the field of education to grow leaders and to expose me to new ideas. And he really accelerated my growth, both as a human and as an educator, but also instilled confidence in me that I was ready to assume the superintendency at a young age.
So when you had the teachers and the students walk out that first year you were a principal, how did you rebound from that?
I listened.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the most important thing that I did, is that it was humbling. And I joke all the time. My wife is an English teacher, and she says that humbling is a vastly overused word, like particularly when people use it when they're receiving an honor. But in that instance, it truly was the textbook definition of humbling for me. It brought me down. It lowered me.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me realize that my entire life I had been called a leader. But when I reflected on what I had done, is I had just gotten stuff done. I was somebody that was a workhorse and would get things done. And I hadn't really established myself as somebody that was able to kind of win over the hearts and minds and change attitudes and behaviors and beliefs of other adults. And I realized that if I wanted to be successful in this, that's what I needed to do. And as I was sitting, I remember very vividly sitting on a picnic table watching this walkout take place around my school, that I have 30 more years in education before I'm going to retire. And so I was uncomfortable. They were uncomfortable. They were unhappy, so I was unhappy. I had a very clear choice to make. Is this how I want to live the next 30 years of my life, or do I want to change my techniques and my tactics and hopefully create the same outcomes, but do so in a way that it's in us instead of me kind of dragging a school behind me.
Mm-hmm. So you would call that a turning point in your career as a leader?
Unmistakably, undeniably, to the point where I can vividly close my eyes right now and picture exactly where I was sitting as these thoughts were rolling through my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great story to hear how that changed you. And you definitely had that support of the superintendent that you worked with that shaped you. And then when you yourself going into the superintendency after did you stay at that same school for 4 years?
Yeah. So by the time, when I announced that I was leaving to go to the neighboring district as superintendent, there were many tears shed at the faculty meeting, which we kind of all laughed about, because hey, could you imagine this happening 3 years ago, where we were both crying that I was, you guys were crying that I was leaving and I was crying that I was leaving. 3 years prior, it would have been a parade. So there's a lot of relationship repair and culture damage that was repaired in the course of 3 years. And it taught me a lot about how to do that, how to build the culture, because what I essentially had done is tore the culture apart. And in many ways, the culture was damaged as it was, and it needed to be repaired. But instead of trying to build on what their current strengths were, I just kind of destroyed the whole thing and built it from anew, which would not be the strategy that I deploy today.
Yes, and that definitely shows everybody that even if you are a principal, you still have a lot to learn, and that you can change and things can get better. You didn't leave that school, you were able to turn it around. And people were sorry to see you go when you left to be a superintendent. Let's go and talk a little bit, go back in time a little bit before you were a principal and talk about when you were a teacher. Are there any particular instances that you can recall from your teaching career that has shaped you as a district leader?
Yeah, I think that the thing that comes to mind very vividly is that I was never evaluated in my entire teaching career.
Wow.
I had one observation, and I ended up with about a page and a half of like very small handwriting notes on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And it was put in my mailbox, and that was the entirety of it. Now, in hindsight, that piece of paper had wonderful pedagogical advice. So it wasn't that I didn't have a skilled or knowledgeable administrator that was working on my behalf, just that I didn't see him or her in this case. And so as I think about where I was at, I was ambitious, I was well-intentioned and hardworking, and I had no clue what I was doing in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I loved kids. Kids liked me. I was able to develop some skills over time, but I think I may have been pretty decent if somebody would have helped me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the end of the day, what I left with was I was a pretty cool teacher that kids liked, and we still stay in contact, but I don't know that I, taught them the deep analysis and the ability to think critically about sociology and the impact that society had on them, which I could have if I would have had somebody investing in me. And so as I think about myself as a district leader, but I just don't ever want somebody to be in the position I was, that is well-intentioned, eager, wants to learn and get better, but doesn't have somebody there on the other end to provide the support to that person that is, again, doing the best that they can. But the old proverbial toolbox, like I didn't have very many tools in it.
Mm-hmm.
I needed someone to invest in me so I could get some more tools. I would have worked hard for them. And I just don't want, that's kind of my calling as an instructional leader, is just to make sure that nobody at any point feels like they're not being invested in,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can't become the best version of themselves as a teacher as possible.
So what would you say is a good number of times people should visit a class per year as a school leader? I was also only visited once a year, and they did the yearly evaluation, but that was based on 1 or 2 observations. So what would be the ideal number of times a principal or assistant principal should visit their teachers' classrooms?
As many as the teacher can tolerate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that's a gauged answer, but as principal, this was one of the initial complaints about me, is that I was in classrooms far too much. So they went from having 0 classroom support to seeing me, multiple times a month with written feedback. And it was almost too much of a dramatic culture change to handle. When I arrived in this new district, we've set an expectation of, I think it's at least 2 per semester. And I don't know that that's enough,
Mm-hmm.
but for me, it's about the relationship between the administrator and the teacher, and the understanding of at what point, it's just like, it's almost, not to use a buzzword or whatever, but it's similar to differentiating for our students.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a teacher that's willing to learn and trusts you and is able to take the feedback, I don't think you can be in there too much. If you have a teacher that, again, might be willing to learn, but the fact when you're in their classroom provides them stress for 2 to 3 days and it makes them anxious, then I don't think we need to do it more than once a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to be thoughtful in the approach, and it's not a one size fits all in terms of how that works. And I also think that now as a district leader, it's my job to create systems in which allow this to happen beyond the administrator. So I know that when my instructional coaches are in the classroom, it's a much less stressful experience for my teachers. And quite frankly, my instructional coaches may be better at giving feedback than my administrators.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a true growth situation then. So for me, it's about finding the right system in place to provide the amount of support, as opposed to trying to quantify the precise number of observations that an administrator does or a teacher receives.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's been changing a lot in the past 5 years. I think we've both been in education about the same amount of years. And, I see there's a lot more instructional coaches today, and administrators do tend to get into the classrooms more often than before. And, hopefully there are not so many teachers now that feel like they're on their own island, like you felt when you were a young teacher. So going to that phase when you were a teacher, was there an instance in your teaching career where you felt buried in the trenches, and how did you pick yourself up and keep moving forward?
Yeah, I think anyone that's been in education any amount of time that tells you they haven't felt buried in the trenches before is probably not telling you a whole truth. So I think there's countless times where I felt buried as a principal, AP, teacher, superintendent. The one that sticks out to me the most was some really horrible but candid advice that I received from teachers when I started. So I taught an entirely African American student population building, 100% African American. I was one of, I'd say, 10 to 15 Caucasian teachers, and I came from a very high performing suburban high school. And so my idea of instruction was simply based on the modeling that I had received, much more the modeling I received in high school than it was based on the methods classes that I received in college. And so as I tried to teach the students the way that I was taught, the feedback I received was basically like, these kids aren't going to do that for you. You should probably pull back a little bit. And what I did is I just fundamentally shifted my expectations down and proceeded. And what I should have done and what I learned over time and experience was that my expectations should have stayed exactly where they were. Those kids were capable of doing the work. Now, the method in which I was teaching them needed to shift so that they were capable of achieving at high levels. They weren't ready to learn the way that I had learned. And that was no fault of their own. That was just the experience that they had in the classroom. So in order for me to reach them, I had to do something different. That was different than the feedback I received, and that was different than what I started to do. So as I lowered my expectations, and students still struggled, and students still didn't do the requisite amount of work, and I was still not able to make the impact that I wanted to, I felt buried in the trenches because the joy of teaching was lost for me.
Yeah.
So until I was able to figure out these kids are capable of doing anything. So I don't need to change that. I can go back and still expect more than them, and I can still expect more of the kids that I'm serving than my peers are, and that's fine. Now it's just up to me to find different strategies to get them there. And then it became a challenge and a competition internally for me to find those right strategies. But more than that, it felt like I was doing what I was, and to be called sounds like a weird thing to say, but I felt like I was enacting my calling, like I was serving kids. I was leaving them better than I found them. But in the moment where I lowered the expectations and the kids still weren't performing, I had lost my joy in education. And so it took me a while to crawl out of that trench.
And what did you do to crawl out? Did you get help from colleagues that were maybe outside of the school? Did you go to conferences? Did you read professional materials? What helped you the most?
So I would love to tell you something like that, but I taught in a school where you had to bring your own copy paper. So there wasn't professional development, and it was 20 years ago, so I wasn't flopping onto Twitter.
Yeah.
So this was trial and error and wrestling with my own ethos and philosophy to figure out what I could do to best serve kids. So that it wasn't a quick fix for me. It was just grinding and having the instinct that what I was doing wasn't good enough or right, that I needed to change my behavior in order to be the man in some ways that I needed to be and the educator that I wanted to be.
Yeah, well, that's great hearing how you were able to make that realization very early on in your career, how you could best serve your kids. And, it is easier for people today, and we have professional development at the tip of our fingers, especially now during the pandemic with so much online professional development.
And just to speak to that, there also is it was a blessing and a curse to have very little administrative oversight. Right. So I had my own laboratory to experiment in. If it didn't work, nobody, the expectations were so low that there was no accountability for me if I screwed it up. Right. So I had the ability to finagle, tweak, and to try things that I know many of new teachers and different, more established and like ostensibly better systems don't have those same type of opportunities to just experiment the way that I did.
Yeah, and that's just the way a lot of us learned early on in our careers, kind of just trial and error. And if a lesson didn't work, or if a piece of our curriculum didn't work with the kids, we found something that would work. So let's talk about your time as a school leader, a building leader. What do you believe your biggest responsibility to your teachers was in the building and is in your district?
So if I'm interviewing for a position or writing, that my educational philosophy kind of stays relatively consistent, and that is that it's the job of the leader to set really high expectations first, then second, to provide tons of support that meets people where they're at and brings them forward, and then third is to provide accountability if it doesn't work, and if it does work, to celebrate the heck out of it. And so for me, the thing that I did as a principal that led my building to have success was that I set really high expectations for performance. I believed that my teachers were greater than they did, and eventually they performed that way. And like I said, that my tactics weren't the support that I was providing, that second stage wasn't always appropriate or well-founded. And so I had to modify the tactics to do better. But the setting really high expectations was really the philosophy that pulled that building forward. So now as a district leader, it's the same thing. I believe that I still have to set those high expectations. I just believe the support is a little bit different, because now as I'm supporting them through the 20 members of my leadership team, the instructional coaches, the principals, the directors, in order to make sure that they have what they need to be successful to do their job. And that's a little bit of a different deviation and approach for me, as I kind of see the world from a different lens. That it's about the encompassing of the support for the teacher is much different, more comprehensive than I imagined it as a principal. And I think that's why I struggled early on in my principal career, is because I did see it through a very laser-like lens. And I think that as I continue to develop experience and expertise, I just continue to think that lens kind of widens in terms of what providing support and opportunities for growth for my teachers look like.
When you first became a principal, did you have a goal in mind to be different than the principals that you had when you were a teacher? Because you said you were left alone a lot, you were hardly ever observed. Did you have that goal in mind first thing off to be vastly different?
So I would say that I didn't have that, like, if I was telling the truth, like as I was interviewing, that wouldn't have been something that I said. As I went in and did the meet with anyone that will allow me to meet with them my first summer, and I probably had like 120 interviews in 80 days to figure out what was, what's the one thing you would never change about the school? What's the one thing you definitely would change about it? What the piece of advice you would give me? Just ask 3 questions and listen and soak in all that information. What I turned that list into, instead of as a collaborative, long-term project to whittle away at things, I just saw it as a list of things for me to fix. So what I did is I went in with the mindset of, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to fix that, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to fix that. And some of the things that, like, it's great if I need to fix the water fountain, because that's something I can fix. But like when I'm trying to fix teacher attitude, fix expectation, fix curriculum, and I'm doing all of these things and I did them in an autonomous way. What I did is I just shifted the goalposts so dramatically on the teachers. And again, the right textbook maneuvers, right? Like they were the right decisions of what I was trying to fix. It was the wrong methodology in terms of how to create sustained, lasting change.
So in your role as a principal, did you find something that did work to keep your teachers moving forward when they were previously stuck in their trenches?
I would say that the thing that I've learned as I've softened and developed a lot more intentional empathy, the greatest superpower I have in working with leaders or teachers or whatever it is, and I think it's a superpower that anybody can have, it's not a talent, it's just the ability and willingness to see adults for greater than they currently are. So the example I use with this is anytime that anyone from an assistant principal, a dean, or principal has ever had a conversation with a kid they're about to suspend, at some point in the repertoire of the speech, they say, don't you realize how much potential you have? You could be so great. We go through this whole list of you have all these opportunities in front of you and you're choosing to make a bad decision. And then I ask people, when's the last time you've told a 40-year-old grown man or a 38-year-old grown woman how much potential you see in them? And the answer is almost always never. And so the biggest thing for me is that I just choose to see people for greater than they currently are. And I think in education, we do a wonderful job of doing that with kids. I think we do a horrible job of doing that with adults. And so for me, I take the coaching mindset of typically the answer is within the individual. And if I see them for greater than they are, and I believe the answer is within them, then the way that I talk to them, communicate to them, and provide support to them is most likely going to lead to positive change. And that's how I've changed my leadership approach over the last 7 years, and particularly in the last 4 years. And I think we've had really, really good results as a result of that philosophical and process change.
Do you think that catches new staff members off guard when you ask them a question like that? Do you realize how much potential you have? Because as you said, adults usually never hear that kind of question. Adults are the worst at giving kudos to themselves, right? Putting themselves on a pedestal. So what kind of reactions do you get when you ask maybe new staff members that question?
So typically the new staff members that I have the most direct influence over are already in leadership roles. So when I talk to them about how they see themselves, and that's usually fairly well responded to. When I'm encouraging my team to have those conversations with their direct reports, for the most part, the reaction, and so I still have this reaction from one of my principals that I've been with for 7 years, who is amazing, is every time I start talking to her about like all of the opportunities that are in front of her, from being a potential college professor to district office to being a superintendent, she is totally like, I do not see myself as that. I don't know how you see me as that. And so it's been 7 years and I haven't worn her down yet. So it's not a magic pill, but I know that she knows that I believe in her. And I know that she knows that I think she's extraordinarily talented. And so if my team knows that I have super high expectations of them, and then I'm going to hold them accountable for those, but I also truly deeply in my soul believe in them, then typically what I've seen is we get really great performance. And we have a culture where we've had 0 voluntary turnover in I think 3 years on our leadership team. This year we had 0 voluntary turnover in our entire district of certified staff. So we're building a culture that I think this is starting to sustain itself.
Yeah, and I think more districts can take that mindset, more schools as well. When you show people that you appreciate them, the more likely they are to stay. And when you bring out potential in people that you see that they might not see themselves, the more likely they are to pursue those leadership roles or coaching roles.
One of the things that we did, and this was by accident, so I'd love to tell you, was this like wonderful thought process that I used, but I don't understand why, like when we think about cabinet level or leadership team level, depending on whatever vernacular your district uses, why we close that space off so tight. And so what I've done over the last handful of years is expand that to now we have 4 union members that sit on our leadership team, including the union president every year sits on it. And so A, I'm trying to develop them as leaders. B, they're seeing everything that I'm doing to develop the other leaders. And then C, they're part of every major decision that happens. And as a result, we've had 0 labor discord. Everything's been, and the most important thing is we're developing a bullpen of leaders in our district. We're a small town rural district that, if you go 40 miles north or 40 miles east, you can get almost a double the salary for an administrator. So for us to keep really qualified, talented people it's somewhat challenging. And so for us, it's really incumbent upon us to continually build up that bullpen so that when somebody leaves, that we have at least viable internal candidates to consider. Not that we want to become incestual in our process and only look inside. But I think it's like, if I'm not developing leaders, then what am I doing? To me, that's quite literally my job as superintendent, is to develop better leaders, to grow humans.
And you've built that culture over those years that you've been superintendent. It seems that, and that kind of leads into another point that we're really concerned with today, with the teacher stress and burnout after having the at-home learning and distance learning, and not knowing quite how the 2021 school year is going to look. So with teacher burnout at an all-time high, if you could consult social media, you see what they're talking about, and some of the venting that's going on with the teachers. What strategies do you deploy as a school leader to combat that teacher stress and burnout?
Yeah, so I don't have the playbook on this. I wish I did. I hope I do, right? Like, I hope that when we come back, our teachers are going to feel supported and listened to, and they'll have the ability to support our kids, which are going through the same stressful trials and tribulations at this point. But I think that two things come to mind immediately that we try to do all the time. Number one is listen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in fact, we just had this conversation with my leadership team today, is that facts don't always overweigh feelings. And so when we get into a conversation where we're trying to use data, and somebody's trying to tell us how they feel, we're speaking two different languages. And so if we're in that situation as a leader and we're trying to use science, facts, data to convince somebody to change somebody's hearts, minds, beliefs, and they're talking out of emotion, the best thing we can do is listen.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're speaking two different languages, all it's going to do is be frustrating unless we take the time to listen and understand and validate that that's how they're feeling. And so the first thing I would say to any administrator wondering how to work with teachers next year is however they're feeling right now, whether they are scared because of COVID, whether they are feeling they're having different emotions bubble up because of the racial tension that's resulted from the Floyd murder, whatever they're feeling they're entitled to feel that way. And it's okay for them to feel that way. And so to tell them to suck it up and get back on the horse, that's a strategy. I don't think it's a good one, but it's a strategy. So for me, the first thing is to listen. And the second thing for me is, and I know this is an oversimplification and, dropping buzzwords, but I believe in it, is Maslow before Bloom.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we believe that we have to tend to Maslow before we can really expect deep critical thought and energy and effort from somebody at a deep intellectual level, then we have to be aware of what's going on in Maslow. And if people don't believe that and they say, oh, that's a thing for kids, the example I always use with them is, when's the last time you had a fight with your significant other in the morning? And how good were you the first 2 hours of the day?
Yeah.
And because when you're stressed out, when the brain is under stress, it's quite literally a chemical equation, right? Like, we're releasing neurotoxins in that are going to diminish. We're releasing cortisol. We're doing all kinds of things that are going to increase our stress, decrease our ability to think critically. And so when we've been living under that scenario for months, then of course we're going to have to tend to that as our teachers come back. Now, how we do that in a systematic and sustainable fashion, I don't know. Like we closed our meeting today when we were talking about kids, about just loving them up. Like, loving up our kids is a strategy. And if that's a strategy for our kids, because we know what they've gone through, then I think it has to be a strategy for how we treat and interact with our teachers as well.
Yes, definitely. And, all too often the staff are forgotten, right? Because we're thinking we're putting kids first. But I think in any school culture, when, the teachers are happy, when they feel appreciated, then it reflects on how they're interacting with the kids. So definitely.
I mean, so for me, very personally, when the initial wave of COVID hit and schools across the country were locked down, I went into hyper efficient, effective work mode for like 70 straight hours. We turned the battleship around in the ocean, and we went the other direction, remote learning. And then I was like paralyzed for 10 days. And I cried more in those 10 days. And I don't know why I cried, but I cried because I had all of my prior health issues bubbled up, and stress and anxiety inside me. And then it took me a while to pull myself out of there. And I quite literally trained people on how to get themselves out of these funks and how to work through it. And it took me a month to get through this. And so for me, it allows me to have a deep sense of empathy for when people are struggling. And as I work through with my leadership team, it's been very nonlinear for me. So it's been, once I got back to myself, then, one of my principals dropped off, then a different director, and then they came back, and somebody, and it's been very weird to see the emotional toll this is taking on people and how they're responding to it. And again, if this is me working with highly trained, intellectually gifted, hardworking people, then that's pretty much a good supposition that this is happening across multiple populations with anyone that we're going to work with and or serve. And if we're not prepared to potentially slow down to take care of the social emotional needs first, I think any of the things that we try to do to cram in professional development on the teacher side or to cram in content and curriculum on the student side is pretty foolhardy.
Thank you for being so vulnerable and talking about your own experience, just having that breakdown after working so hard to get remote learning off the ground. And I can understand how, it does take a toll on those various leaders, and it shows just the kind of culture you have in your team, that those leaders are willing to share, that they just, they need some time, and they're going through a lot themselves. So I hope that's something that a lot of us district leaders and school leaders will think about as they're welcoming their staff back, and as they're having conversations with them over the summer.
Yeah, it's interesting because nothing has reaffirmed my passion and drive to create better educational systems for kids and adults than what's taken place, but nothing has also minimized it into the broader scope of what's going on in our world and in individual lives, is to understand that we are just a blip on that radar. So it's been a really interesting dichotomy for me to be so, to have my awareness peaked on both aspects as to how truly important and vital we are, but really how minuscule we are at the same time. And it's been a really interesting kind of dissonance for me to work through.
Yeah, I think so. It's been a wake-up call for everybody, and I think everybody's going to approach things in a different way. If there's one piece of advice you could give a new administrator on how to work with teachers, especially for this coming fall, what would it be?
The one piece of advice I give to anyone, and this is, there's no difference between if it was this fall or any other fall, is that you're not there to fix anybody, or you're not there to fix other people's behavior. You're there to lead, you're there to try to influence, but you have no control in the long run over anyone else's behavior, so it's not yours to fix. And so when I started communicating to people, trying to influence them, to try to lead them, to try to teach them, as opposed to try to fix them, that's when I went from being a relatively toxic leader to a pretty effective leader. And so I think what happens with a lot of young administrators, with truly operating out of the best of intentions, so not people that, not bad people, not long-term bad administrators, they come in with the intent to fix as opposed to the intent to lead. And lead might be a little bit slower, but it's much more sustainable, and it's going to be a much more pleasant ride than if you go in trying to fix people or try to fix systems immediately.
Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast. If there's one thing you'd like the listeners to remember from this conversation, what would that be?
It kind of go back to my very first answer, is that time is a finite resource, and to live a life of passion and purpose.
Thank you so much. If listeners would like to reach out to you, where can they find you?
My email is pcaposey, PCAPOSEY @gmail.com. And I'm available on just about every social media platform at MCUSD, SUPE, SUPE. I love to connect with you guys.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.